presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Anne Marie, I think one person might have called in on their phone, so I let them know that they can just unmute and ask their question if they have something.
Great, thank you. All right, let's get started. So thanks for attending the Community Initiatives Application Workshop. On this screen, you'll see that there is a link to the actual application for the program for this year. I've included it in other slides throughout. We'll also be posting this PowerPoint presentation to our ZoomGrants site, as well as to the Cultural Arts Division Community Initiatives or Open Applications webpage. So if you want to look it up or reference this again, you'll see it in other places and you can find it there later. So next, we're going to talk about the purpose of the Community Initiatives Program, definitions and terms that I'll be using throughout. And then we'll talk about some things that you need to be thinking about before you actually submit your application. And then we'll touch a little bit on the actual application process. Next, the purpose of the program is to provide support for smaller community arts projects and activities that develop throughout the year, and to support public arts and cultural programming that celebrates Austin's culture of creativity, to encourage collaboration, innovation, and accessibility, as well as cultural tourism. Some definitions. So we will be using the term historically underrepresented communities, which the Community Initiatives Program actually seeks to provide members of historically underrepresented communities, which include people and organizations that identify as Black or African American, Arab American, Asian American, Hispanic or Latinx, Asian or Pacific Islander, Indigenous nations, LGBTQIA, or persons with disabilities, with equitable access to funding opportunities. Applicants who are members of historically underrepresented communities are strongly encouraged to apply in this program. Fiscal sponsor essentially references a nonprofit organization with 501c status who applies for financial support on behalf of another organization or individual in order to enable that individual or organization to receive the benefits of tax-exempt status. There are several types of fiscal sponsorship, but in every case, the fiscal sponsor takes on responsibility for those external parties, and that the funds will be utilized for tax-exempt charitable purposes as defined by the IRS. So essentially, they're umbrellaing that individual or organization that does not have 501c status with their nonprofit status. And so the sponsored project, which is the next term, is essentially the individual or unincorporated group that is fiscally sponsored by that umbrella organization. In kind references support or charitable giving, which isn't money, but is instead goods or services that would normally have to be paid for. So volunteer support, or someone donates materials or food, gives you a discount on space, venue rental, or any sort of discount that you wouldn't normally receive, could be considered in-kind support. So those are some terms that I'll be using in this presentation. So we've had a few changes and updates to the CI program. So if you are familiar with community initiatives or you've applied in the past, we've made a couple changes. Last year in FY20, we used a new scoring rubric, which allowed us to help determine how to award funds. We've made a few tweaks to the rubric for this fiscal year to take into consideration the COVID-19 impacts. But not a whole lot has changed there, but I'll go over those changes in more detail later in the presentation. We are not requiring a match this year for the Community Initiatives Program. However, you can include in your budget and in your application proposal other sources of income that you think you'll be bringing in, whether that's earned revenue from ticket sales, things like that, or whether that's from other sources like other grants or other donors. You can include those in your budget, but are not required. And then the last thing that's new that wasn't available in FY20 is that you can actually do your events online. In FY20, it was a requirement that your events be presented in person. But with the COVID restrictions and the limits on how many people can gather in one space, we've made it an option for you to be able to host, receive funding to host a virtual event. So next, if my slides will advance, there we go. So here's some top 10 things you want to think about as you're working through deciding whether or not the Community Initiatives Program is something that you want to apply for. We're going to talk about whether or not what the eligibility requirements are, what the requirements are for the events that you're proposing. You have to set an event date in advance. It can be a tentative date, but that essentially determines when you will apply for funding. We'll talk about whether or not you may want or need a fiscal sponsor. We'll talk about the scoring process, the payment timeline if you're awarded, whether or not you need insurance, how to market to tourists and visitors, and whether or not you can produce the event without the city funds because you may not receive them by the time you need them. As the nature of funding from the city goes, it's not known for being super fast. And then the contract requirements, what is required if you are awarded community initiatives dollars. So are you eligible? Eligibility in this program is pretty broad. You can be a non-arts or arts 501c3, or excuse me, 501c organization, or you can be fiscally sponsored as an individual artist or as an incorporated group or unincorporated group. And the difference between unincorporated and incorporated is essentially an incorporated group is an organization that is registered as a nonprofit with the state of Texas, but does not yet have their 501c status. So you're sort of in that intermediate stage between an unincorporated group, but you're taking the steps to become your own 501c and just may not be there. And then you can also choose to apply directly. So you can apply directly as an individual artist, or you can apply directly as an unincorporated or incorporated group. So applicants must be a resident of Austin or its extraterritorial jurisdiction, or ETJ, for at least 1 year prior to the application deadline. So that means if you just moved to Austin, or if your organization was just founded, you may have to wait a period of at least 1 year before submitting your application, depending on what deadline you will be submitting. So if you just moved to Austin last September 1st, the first deadline for this fiscal year is August 31st, you wouldn't be eligible to apply. You'd have to wait until the October deadline, because at that point, you will have met that requirement of being here for a year. You have to have experience producing work in your artistic expertise for at least 1 year prior to the deadline. You have to have some sort of income and expenses related to that work for at least 1 year prior to the deadline. You can't be receiving funding from another cultural arts division program, and you can't receive either another cultural arts division program or any other funds from the city. So if you're looking for sponsorship from other departments, if you end up being awarded community initiatives dollars, you may have to choose between, do I accept the sponsorship dollars from the Health and Human Services Department of the city, or do I accept the Community Initiatives Award if it's for the same project? Now, if it's for different projects, then you can accept either. You can't receive funding from multiple departments for the same contracted event. And you can't have received community initiatives funding for more than 5 years. At that point, we hope that you'll be interested in applying for other programs, either within the community, within the Cultural Arts Division, or in other grantors. So is your event eligible? So your event that you're proposing has to be an arts or cultural activity that happens in Austin or the ETJ. So it can't be something that happens in Round Rock or Bastrop or Buda. It has to be in Austin. And it has to be advertised broadly to tourists and residents. And the reason why we ask that you advertise to tourists is because these funds come from the hotel occupancy tax. And so you have to provide a good faith effort showing that you're going to advertise to tourists. And we have resources in the guidelines on our website. So if you're unfamiliar with how to reach out to tourists, we have some resources and tools that you can use to reach out to those potential audience members. We fund a variety of different types of projects. So it could be a single event. It could be a series of events. Maybe you're doing poetry readings for 3 months, once a month, and you're inviting different poets to be featured. That would, you could apply for the $3,000 award through community initiatives for those 3 events. Or it could be a combination of different events. You could have a poetry reading, and then you're going to do another event that's interviewing authors of nonfiction, because your organization is a literary group. And so you're doing sort of a variety of different activities that highlight literature in Austin, as an example. If you are going to be doing public art projects, so this essentially means if you're going to be putting up a sculpture somewhere or a mural, you have to obtain permission from the property owner. It needs to be part of your application when you submit it. So if you're working with a private owner, property owner, you just need to have them provide a letter of support for your project and say, yes, we're really excited to have this sculpture put on our property or this mural painted on the side of our building. Or if the piece is going to be put on City of Austin property, you have to go through another application process called the Artwork and Donation and Loan application. And that has to be reviewed by the Arts Commission, and it can be reviewed simultaneously as they're reviewing your actual CI application. But you'll want to make sure that you're contacting my colleague, Frank Wick, in the Art and Public Places Department, or program, our Public Places program, within the Cultural Arts Division, and his contact information is there on the screen. And if you have questions about that, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to connect you directly. So we do ask that you set your event date, even if it's tentative, to determine when you should apply. So the first deadline, the first quarterly deadline, is coming up on August 31st. And that will be for events happening between October 1 and December 31st of this year. So if you are thinking of doing a holiday show, then you'll want to apply by August 31st. So anything occurring between October 1 of this year through December 31st, you need to apply by August 31st. A couple of things to note: that we're actually talking about the event occurring within that time frame, not rehearsals starting, not planning of the event. It's the actual public component that's happening in that time frame. So if you're starting the filming of your mini documentary on October 1st, you wouldn't apply necessarily on August 8th or on August 31st, because you won't be screening that until maybe next September 1st, so September 2021. And that means your deadline to apply would be later in the year. So the next deadline after August 31st is October 26th, and that's for events happening January 1 of 2021 through March 31st of 21. The third quarter deadline is January 27th for events happening April 1st through June 30th. And then the fourth quarter is April 28th. And that is for events happening July 1 through September 30th of 2021. So basically, you're applying anywhere from 2 to 5 months out of when your public event is essentially going to happen. And our fiscal year is October 1 through September 30th. So your activities have to fall within that time frame. So if you are working on a documentary and you know that you're not going to have anything ready to screen until the December of 2021, you wouldn't be applying in this fiscal year for community initiatives funds. You would be waiting until we release the guidelines for 2022, which won't be until next summer or a year from now. So just some things to think about in terms of timeline and when to submit your application. So then, do you need a fiscal sponsor? So if you are applying and you're not applying for a nonprofit organization, you may want to have a fiscal sponsor, but again, it's not a requirement in the Community Initiatives Program, so it's kind of up to you if you need the support that's provided by a fiscal sponsor. So fiscal sponsors will invite you to apply. So they'll send you a link that says, here's the link to start your application. So you wouldn't go directly and start your application today. You'd want to get in touch with a fiscal sponsor first. They actually submit the application on your behalf. They often will set their own internal deadlines because they need to review and submit for you. They may have their own internal requirements. Some fiscal sponsors require that you submit an application to them first before you can be fiscally sponsored. Some just require to have a conversation with you about what you're doing and what your plans are. Fiscal sponsors will often review applications for you, so it's basically administrative support. They'll review your budgets, they'll review the application and narrative. They often will provide free or low-cost insurance, so if you are required to have insurance for your project, they can provide that for you. And it isn't necessarily that has to, a cost that has to come out of your own pocket or out of your overall budget for your project. And then if you wanted to go the extra step, some fiscal sponsors will allow you to accept donations on their behalf, or they will accept donations on your behalf, I should say, that will provide your donors with a tax deduction. So if you're looking to do additional fundraising and you don't have a 501c status and you feel like that would be beneficial to you, you may want to reach out to a fiscal sponsor because they can help you with that. We have a list of fiscal sponsors that we can provide you. It's also in the guidelines for the application in the back, at the very back of the guidelines, or you can reach out to me to get that list. We do have requirements for fiscal sponsors, so if you have a nonprofit in mind that you'd like to work with that we haven't worked with already, they have to meet this criteria. They have to be headquartered in Austin. They have to have a board that meets 3 times a year. They have to have a paid executive director. We don't care how much they're paid. It could be $10 a year, but they have to be compensated in some way. And then depending on how long the organization has been around, they have to either have a $50,000 or more annual budget or a $35,000 or more annual budget. So you'll want to make sure that whatever nonprofit you're looking at to serve as your fiscal sponsor meets that criteria. So again, fiscal sponsors will provide you with that application. They'll provide you with their vendor code to put into the application. So these are all things that they're providing that will actually go into your application to be submitted. And so you just want to make sure that you're able to collect that from your fiscal sponsor. So let's talk about the scoring rubric. The scoring rubric that was developed in 2020 was based on the City of Austin Strategic Direction 2023, which is a citywide strategic plan for the next 5 years, or right now, I guess, for the continuation of the next 3 years. And the Arts Commission's 4 pillars of how they want to allocate funds. There's a lot of parallel between those 2 documents. And so we built a rubric that sort of aligns with some priorities that are listed in those programs or in those documents. we will fund, the idea is that the rubric will fund activities that align most closely to those priorities. However, we don't expect every applicant to align with every single priority listed in the scoring rubric. And we know most applicants won't. There's a maximum score of 24 points. We have enough funds to fund 16 applications per quarter. And so the 16 highest scoring applicants will be awarded funds. But there's no minimum score to be awarded. So if we only have 15 applicants applying in one quarter, we could potentially fund everyone, even if one of those applicants only had a score of 1. I don't anticipate that will be very frequent because this program is pretty popular. Last year, we had probably about 50 to 60 applications per quarter. I imagine we'll have about the same for this fiscal year. So it can be somewhat competitive. So just something to keep in mind. So here is the breakdown of the scoring rubric. And I'm going to go into detail for each one and provide some examples of how one might qualify to get those particular points. So we're looking for representational diversity within the applicant and the applicant organization. Whether or not your event will be informed by the community. If you are producing a cultural event, is it being produced with integrity? Are you including accessibility and inclusion in the planning of your event? And then is there some sort of educational component? Are you a first-time applicant? Are you providing affordable access to your programming? That doesn't necessarily have to be free, but are you providing discounts or accommodation for members of the community with lower income? Are you paying the people participating in your project, even if it's $25? Are you doing any work? Are you offering an internship or apprenticeship as part of the project? And then do you have any partners or collaborators that you're working with? So that's sort of the summary and point values of the rubric. So priority 1, we're looking for representational diversity. It's worth 5 points. So if your organization, or if you're an individual artist, if yourself, your staff and board, or the artists that you're hiring or bringing in to participate in the project, identify as members of the BIPOC, LGBTQ, and or disability communities, if they're 50% or more of the representative total group, you will receive 5 points. If your activity is community informed, the activity essentially provides an opportunity for community input, at least at some stage before the work is presented and that community feedback is developed into the artistic vision of the work, then that's worth 5 points. So something like you have a mural that you're working on in a particular neighborhood and you invite the community to come and help tell their story about their neighborhood, and you want to incorporate their stories into your mural, that would be community informed. However, if you were to do your mural and you just invited the community out to help you paint it, that we wouldn't count that. They need to be part of the development of the actual artistic product. So that's just something to think about. Again, that may not be the purpose of what you're trying to achieve through your work, and so we don't necessarily, it's not a requirement for you to have community informed work, but if you do, it's worth 5 points. Cultural integrity is the activity representative of the cultural heritage from the cultural group that the applicant belongs to. So essentially what we mean here is, let's say you are a Japanese theater company and you want to produce Shakespeare. If you produce Shakespeare, that's great, but it's not really tied to your cultural identity as a Japanese theater artist. It's a Western art form. But if that Japanese community theater presented Shakespeare, but in a kabuki style theatrical performance, then yes, that would be, we would give 5 points for cultural integrity for that particular type of event. So priority 2, accessibility and inclusion. This is worth 3 points. So are you including adaptations or services for audience members with disabilities? And this can be either virtually or in person. So it could be, are you thinking about hiring someone to do audio description or ASL interpretation, American Sign Language interpretation? If you're doing an event that's in person, what are some other ways that you're providing additional services besides what is mandated by the Americans for Disabilities Act for physical facilities like ramps and bathrooms that have accommodations? So those are all base level. We're looking for what are you building on top of that? So what additional services are you providing? Again, you may not have thought about how this might apply to your events. But you may want to think about that and see if it's appropriate for the type of work you're wanting to present and include that in your application. Priority 3, so there are 6 points total here. Each of these is worth 1 point each, so knowledge sharing. Is there an explicit supplemental learning component that is interactive or facilitated in which audience members can access specialized knowledge from the artist? So essentially we're looking for a very specific structured additional workshop or training. This a talk back after a dance or theater performance or a film wouldn't count here. It would have to be a separate additional activity. The event itself can't be considered the educational component. So if you're doing a historical drama, that in and of itself wouldn't be considered knowledge sharing, but if you were going to do some sort of additional educational component on the side, you could get points for that. Are you a first-time applicant? Pretty straightforward. Have you ever applied for community initiatives funding before? If not, or at least been a recipient, I should say. Have you ever received community initiatives funding before? Affordability. Are you offering low or no cost options for audience members who are experiencing financial barriers? So you don't necessarily have to have an event that's free of charge. You certainly can if that's your choice. But you can certainly charge for admission or access to the virtual event. But if you are offering opportunities for folks who are experiencing financial barriers, discounted tickets, free tickets, offering opportunities for volunteers to participate in the event for free, you'll want to include that in the application. Compensates personnel. Are you paying the artists and administrators that are participating in the project? And you know, any sort of payment would be acceptable. If you feel like it's within your budget to pay your artists and administrators, but you don't have a whole lot, that's fine. It could be as little, you know, as $25 for their work, whatever sort of stipend you feel you can afford. Again, it's not a requirement that you have, that you pay artists or administrators, but we would like to encourage you to provide some sort of compensation if you can. Cultural and artistic innovation. Is this a new work? And you'll describe how it is a new work, if it is. And are you offering an internship or an apprenticeship for this proposed project? That's also pretty straightforward. So the yes or no. In addition, so if you decide that you are going to offer expanded ADA services, we are offering an additional up to $500 in funding to cover some or all of those potential fees. Not every applicant will receive this $500 supplemental award, but the top 4 scoring applicants who have an ADA service in their application will receive an award up to $500 depending on how much they're including for those services in their budget. So you want to make sure that if you're going to have ADA services that you research the cost of those include that in your budget. What else? We do list resources for this in the guidelines. So if you're unsure what potential services you could be including in your project, we can connect you to some resources to help you figure that out. Okay, so we have about $48,000 available per quarter, which is about 16 contracts that we can fund. You can request up to $3,000. Again, there's no matching requirement, so it's $3,000. Requesting less than $3,000 isn't going to increase your score or isn't going to help you receive the funds necessarily. So if you can spend the $3,000, I would just ask for the $3,000. Next, will you need insurance? It depends. If your event is completely virtual, we will be waiving the insurance requirements. However, if you are doing an event that you imagine will be an in-person event, you may be required to carry general liability, auto liability, liquor liability if you're going to be selling alcohol at your event. If you, as the artist producer of the event, is responsible for selling alcohol, you'll be required to carry liquor liability. And then if your event will be scheduled or produced on city property that's not managed by the Parks and Rec department, like at a library, for example, you may be required to have workers' compensation insurance. So just some things to keep in mind. You can use city funds, the CI award, to pay for these required insurance. However, you likely won't have the funds in advance enough to purchase it. So just keep that in mind when you're budgeting, that you may need to set aside some money to purchase the required insurance. Now, as you're applying, don't buy insurance right now. Wait until you've given notice that you have received an award for community initiatives, and then wait until I verify that you are indeed required to have a specific type of insurance before you go out and buy it. Do you have to market to tourists and visitors? Yes, you do, 100%. It is a requirement, it's a contract requirement. So we have some workshops that were created a year or two ago called Get Noticed that cover PR and marketing strategies. There are 3 videos. One is on just general PR and marketing, just the basics. One is specific to social media. And then the third one is a panel discussion with local bloggers and arts and culture journalists who talk about how to go about getting their attention for your events. So really helpful, very relevant. That's a great place to get started to figure out what your marketing is going to look like. We also offer some marketing resources. In the guidelines itself, we have some information on marketing to tourists. We also will promote your events on our social media. You just have to contact myself or Kamiko and provide just a 2 or 3 sentence description of your event along with a nice high-res image that we can share on our social media. You want to make sure that you're getting that information about 2 weeks before your event is going to occur. And then we'll do our best to post it. We can't guarantee it depending on how much other stuff is being posted at that same time and whether or not we have a lot of COVID news that we need to be posting on our social media. But just something to keep in mind. We will assist you. Additionally, you are required to, if you are awarded funds, to put the city's logo, or the Cultural Arts Division logo, I should say, on all of your marketing materials, even if it's on a web event, a virtual event. You are required to put our logo somewhere and put our publicity statement, which is in the orange text. The project is supported in part by the Cultural Arts Division of the City of Austin Economic Development Department. You should not use any other text other than that as the publicity statement. So the Cultural Arts Division is not co-producing, it's not presenting, it's not hosting your event. We are supporting it through funding the project. So make sure you're using the correct publicity statement. We also require that you post your events on Visit Austin, and Visit Austin is the convention center's calendar site, and they have well over 300,000 people a month, I believe, coming, checking out things to do in Austin. And so it's a very high traffic, highly visible website where you can post for free your contracted events. So we give you lots of tools to get you seen, ideally by tourists. Again, it's not a requirement that tourists actually attend your events, but you should be making a good faith effort to get them to come. So, can you produce your event without city funds? Now, this is an important thing just to prepare your budget, so you can kind of think about when you might receive funds if you're awarded. So if you apply on August 31st, the Arts Commission will review the applications that are recommended by staff the week of September 22nd. You'll receive notice that week, and you'll have to provide some pre-contract materials. If you get them in by October 1st, we'll start processing your contract. Now, again, remember, this is the beginning of our fiscal year on October 1, so there's a lot happening, a lot of contracts being started, a lot of contracts being closed out. So please give us 2 to 4 weeks to be able to process your contract. So sometime by November 1st, you'll hopefully be able to submit your first invoice. And then it usually takes another 2 to 4 weeks for that check to actually come in the mail. So you're looking anywhere between November 15th and December 1st for your first check to come out. So that means if your event is between October 1 and December 1st, you're not going to receive the city award until later, after your event has occurred. So you want to make sure that you have money on hand to actually be able to produce the event, and then use those funds to essentially reimburse yourself for any expenses laid out up to the award amount. So just something to think about. We will issue up to 75% of your award in your first payment after your contract has been approved. The final 25% of your award amount will be issued once your final report has been submitted and approved. So again, you're not going to have that full $3,000 up front. You'll get 75% of it, which is $2,250, and you'll have that to produce your event once you receive it. And then you have to show in your final report that you've actually spent all $3,000. So you need to make sure that you have, $675 of cash money that you can include from your own pocket before you'll get that final 25% to spend on your project, to show in your final report that it was completely used, all $3,000. Again, the earliest you would receive funds if you apply on August 31st is around November. That would be the earliest. More likely it'll be sometime in December. Just with my historical knowledge, it's more likely December, but it could happen in November. Finally, can you meet the contract requirements? You want to make sure that you can secure insurance if you need it, that it's not going to be a problem for you to place the city logo and publicity statement on all your marketing materials. Are you going to be able to complete the final report workshop? We usually have a video for that you can do online at any time. And then make sure that you're submitting your final report, which is due 30 days after your final event has concluded, rounded to the end of that month. So the latest you could, so if your event is December, your final report would be due at the end of January. So here are the application elements. We're going to talk a little bit about the evaluation criteria and then the different sections of the application real quickly. So staff will review your application using the funding rubric that we covered earlier. So that would be myself and Kamiko reviewing applications and scoring. The highest scoring applications, the top 16, will be moved forward to the Arts Commission for their final approval. And then again, here's the scoring rubric. It's a total of 25 points available. Here's a link to ZoomGrants where the application lives. And then there are 5 sections to the application. There's the summary, eligibility section, which needs to be submitted in advance of the deadline because that has to be approved by staff before you can continue with the rest of the application. You have the application questions, budget and activity summary, and all the attachments. If you are a new applicant and you've never received funds from the city before and you're not planning on applying through a fiscal sponsor, you need to register as a vendor with the city. That's step 1. The best way to find and register as a vendor is to go to Google or use whatever browser search engine you want to search for Austin Vendor Connection, and then click the link for Austin Finance Online, and it'll take you to this page. It looks just like this. And you can create an account, or you can search to see if you still have a vendor account that you set up years ago. There's a variety of ways to look into that. This is the top part of the summary section. You'll need to name your project, put in your request amount, and section 1 summary is essentially just contact information. One thing to note, and that's very important, is that your organization information that you provide has to match exactly to whatever you've put in vendor registration. So any punctuation, any abbreviations needs to match exactly to whatever you put in vendor registration. So keep that in mind. Next section is the eligibility. So we're going to ask you, what type of applicant are you? So are you a nonprofit? Or are you an individual artist? Are you fiscally sponsored? If you are fiscally sponsored, we're going to verify that your fiscal sponsor is eligible to serve as a fiscal sponsor. We'll do applicant eligibility, so we'll go through all of those eligibility questions like how long have you been a resident of Austin? How long have you been producing your artistic work in Austin? Do you have a budget history of producing that work? Are you receiving funds from other city sources? We'll get your vendor registration information. And then if you're a 501c, we have some documents to verify your nonprofit status that you have to upload. Otherwise, if you're an individual artist applying directly or an unincorporated group, there aren't any additional documents you need to upload. There are several questions that you'll need to complete in section 3. This is basically where most of the rubric scoring will happen, is your responses to these questions. Section 4 has 3 components. There's the operating budget history, the actual proposed project budget, and your activity summary. To be eligible to receive funds, you have to have an operating budget history back to 2019, because that's the 1-year requirement, right? So you just need to estimate your total revenue for that year, estimate your total expenses. It doesn't have to balance necessarily, so you could have a deficit if that's the case, or you could have a surplus of funds. For your 2020 budget, you need to indicate whether or not it was projected or actual, and then you're going to propose your total operating budget for 21. So this is the top part of the budget for the actual project, where you're going to talk about the income. I've highlighted here that a lot of these are not required budget line items because we're not requiring that you have a matching component. However, you can include, if you want to show a total picture of the complete budget for your project, and you do know that you're going to have, you hope to bring in some total ticket sales, you can put in that total here, and then just provide in the description box, how you arrived at those numbers. Here's the section for unearned income. So if you're going to get donations from individuals or from foundations, or if you're going to go after business sponsorships, all of that information would go under unearned income. Applicant cash is basically money you have on hand out of your own pocket that you're putting towards this project. Again, these aren't required, but if you want to provide a full picture of your proposed project budget, you can include it here. The only line item in the income section that is required is line item 9A, which is where you're putting in your community initiatives request amount. Again, the maximum is $3,000. If you're going to provide some ADA accessibility services in your project, you'll want to include, however, how much you're hoping to get for that additional $500 award. You would put $500 there, just so we're tracking it. You can also list your in-kind support. So if you're going to have volunteers or anything donated, you can list that in line 11, but again, it's not required. The main thing is that you want the total income to match your total expenses, which is the next part of the budget. So the only part of the expenses section that is required, there are two things. The line items that are circled in the orange box and the blue box. So the orange box is how much you're spending of the CI award, which should total $3,000. That's a requirement. You're essentially telling me how you intend to spend the CI award amount if you were to receive it. And then you use the description box, which is circled in blue, to describe how you arrived at those numbers. So you're going to pay $1,500 to artists. It's 5 performers at $300. So you're just basically breaking down the numbers that you've arrived at. Again, if you are going to include additional other sources of income, you would list those in the cash match column. If you have in-kind that you're including, you'd list that in the in-kind match column. Again, those aren't required, but if you want to show a full picture of your budget, you can list that there. And then if you're going to show ADA expenses, you'll use the ADA expenses column and list that expense in line 17. And again, use the description box to describe, how you're going to spend that $500. And then at the very bottom, you'll see that the total must match the income portion of the budget. So the budget must balance. What else was I going to say? One thing to note is that when you're in ZoomGrants, the budget will calculate, but you have to refresh it. So it doesn't do it automatically. So if you put in $1,500 and the total still says 0, you'll have to go up to the top of the page and hit the refresh button in order for it to show up that $1,500 or to do any calculations. Next are the eligible expenses. So this is what you can spend the community initiatives funding on. So you can use it to pay people, either artists or administrators. You can use it to pay for marketing expenses. So, printing materials, buying ads, what else? Hiring a photographer for your event or a videographer, things like that. You can use it for venue expenses if you're going to have any, insurance, and then any ADA services. Any other expenses has to be covered by funds from another source. So just keep that in mind. These are the things that you can spend the CI money on. Anything else has to be spent using alternative funds. And the last section, or last thing in section 4 is the activity summary. And essentially, you're just going to tell us a summary of what your event is going to be, its title, when it's going to occur, whether or not it's an in-person event or virtual, the venue address. If you are producing the virtual event from your home, you would do your home address here. You would indicate the venue district number and how many activities you're going to offer. So if it's a series of events that you're streaming, how many times are you streaming? In this case, 4. If you don't know your venue district number, the link that's on this slide, and it's also in the instructions within ZoomGrants, basically you can just follow that link, type in your address, and it'll tell you what your district number is. And then the last section, here are the things that you need to submit with your application. So documentation can be anything from resumes of the core artists and producing team, previous marketing materials for other events that you've done, letters of support, although letters of support are not required, but if you have some, you can include it. Links to your website or your social media pages, basically anything so I can see that you have a history of producing artistic work in the past. You'll complete an insurance assessment, so it'll link to a survey that you'll fill out. You'll receive an email once that survey is complete with some tentative insurance requirements. You will upload that PDF document that's emailed to you as your insurance assessment. The same with the accessibility quiz. It's a link that'll take you to a quiz that you'll take, and then you'll just upload a screenshot of the score you received once you completed that quiz. And then the Creative Space survey, again, you'll complete that survey and upload a screenshot confirming that you completed the survey. We have open office hours on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month from 10 a.m. to noon. You can follow that ZoomGrants or Zoom link with that meeting ID and access those open office hours. So I believe the next ones are next Tuesday. So if you have questions about the application, you can come in and just request a conversation with me. I'll come in and answer any questions that you have about the application process. Here's my contact information as well as Kamiko's. Again, the link to the application is there at the bottom of the screen. That basically covers all the basics. So I am going to stop sharing, and we're going to start answering any questions that you may have. Let's see. Go ahead, Kamiko. Oh, you're muted. Here, I'll unmute you.
Sorry. I don't see any questions in the chat, and we're a small enough group where I think we'll be fine if you want to just unmute yourself, and if you want, you can come on camera. If you're more comfortable typing something in the chat, I can read it for you.
I'm going to keep my camera off, but I do have a question about the budget, if I could ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's the, FY 18-19, 19-20, and then 2021 proposed.
Mm-hmm.
If we're operating on a calendar year budget, is the idea that it's the previous year, the current year, and the next year?
Right. So it'd be the final year of the fiscal year listing. So if it's 18-19, we're looking for the 19 calendar year. And then 19-20 would be the 20 calendar year. And the 2021 would be the 2021 calendar year.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Other questions? Kamiko has linked to the ZoomGrants application in the chat. So if you wanted to copy that and go to the ZoomGrants application, you'd be more than welcome to. Other questions?
And I'm sending it one more time just in case someone else came in, oops, a little later.
Michael, you look like you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I just, so I see that this is on a quarterly basis. I was just wondering if we were applying, because we have events that go from throughout the whole year. Or if we had something, for instance, that the $3,000 could potentially fund part of the second quarter, would we just need to would we need to redo the funding for that second quarter, or could we extend the amount of money into the second quarter from the first quarter?
Gotcha. Yeah, so the way that would work is if you have multiple events that will be spanning a quarter, you would apply for both events in the quarter that happens earliest, or for the event that happens the earliest. So if your first event is on November 1st of 2020, and then your second event is on January 15th of 2021, you would apply at the August 31st deadline. And then in that application, you would describe both events. You would describe your event in November, and you would also describe your event in January. Or if you have a series of events that are running the entire fiscal year, you could you would list all of those and then apply for the quarter where the event starts is the initial first public activity. And then a couple things to note about that: if for some reason you aren't funded in the first quarter and you still have that second event coming up, or a third or subsequent events throughout the rest of the fiscal year, you can always resubmit your application in the next quarter for those subsequent events. So if you apply and aren't awarded, you're not out for the entire, you're not disqualified from applying in future quarters. Other questions? Okay, well, I'm just going to type my email into the chat here. So that way, if you have any questions, you can email me directly. I'm also happy to set up a Zoom call one-on-one to answer any questions that you have, or again, you can sign up for our open office hours. We have them on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month from 10 a.m. to noon. Kamiko, was there anything that you think is pressing that should be, that I missed, that should be included? No?
Nope.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, thanks so much for joining us, and I look forward to reviewing your applications.
All right. Bye. I'm going to hit end for everybody.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.